I was 8 years old. Before I ever spoke, everyone in the Stone family said I was an idiot. Even my mother cried in secret, convinced she'd given birth to an autistic daughter. My father looked at me with disappointment every single time, though for the sake of family image, he never sent me off to a special ed school. Then one day, a man from Wall Street showed up to acquire Stone Holdings. He swaggered into our boardroom and cursed out everyone in it, until nobody could even lift their heads. Room full of high-paid executives sat there stiff and silent, scared to answer him. I stood in the corner and nearly fell asleep listening. Then I got annoyed. So I stepped forward and in his own language, spoke the first sentence of this life. My name is Savannah Stone, the only direct heir of the founding branch of Stone Holdings. This should have been one of those silver spoon lives people write envy pieces about. Instead, I was 8 and still hadn't said a word. Everybody in the family knew it, that the eldest daughter of the Stone family was a fool. My mother came from one of those old Charleston families, raised on books, manners, and soft voices. She was graceful, gentle, and poured every bit of her love into me. She used to hold me in her arms and teach me over and over again. Savannah, say it with mommy.
Mom, my...
I would only look at her and stay quiet. The light in her eyes would dim little by little. Then she'd turn away and wipe the corners of her eyes with a tissue, thinking I didn't notice. I noticed everything. It wasn't that I couldn't speak. I just didn't want to. I had come into this life with memories from the last one. Back then, I was a financial analyst who never shut up. I spent 30 years talking, explaining, reporting, persuading, pitching. By the end of it, I was sick to death of hearing my own damn voice. So in this life, I only wanted peace. I wanted to be a useless rich girl, keep my mouth shut and enjoy the ride. What I underestimated was the weight of 5 words. Heir to Stone Holdings. That wasn't a blessing. It was a collar around my neck. My father, Richard Stone, chairman of the company, was a ruthless man in business. Every time he looked at me, there was always a flicker of hope. Savannah, do you know what this is? He'd point at a set of numbers on a quarterly report. I'd nod. Can you tell Dad what the net profit was this quarter? I'd lift my little hand and tap the exact figure. The hope in his eyes would flare brighter. Then he'd ask the question he always wanted to ask. Savannah, say, Dad.
For me.
I'd look at him and stay silent. Just like that, the light would go out like fire, hit by a bucket of cold water. All that remained was disappointment. Heavy, ugly, endless disappointment. He would sit there in silence for a long time, then stand and leave with a hard sweep of his sleeve. That scythe has felt heavy enough to crack the glass walls of the whole building. I knew the truth. If I hadn't been the only direct heir of the main line, if my mother hadn't come from a family powerful enough to matter, my place in this family would have been replaced a long time ago. My cousins had stopped being afraid of me years ago. Now, they just mocked me to my face. Savannah, did you understand anything in English tutoring today? That was Chloe Stone, Uncle Victor's daughter. She was only a year younger than me, but she was quick-tongued, charming, and one of my father's favorites. I gave her one lazy glance and kept walking. That only made her grin wider. Oh, right. I forgot. You're a born genius. You came into the world knowing everything already, unlike us poor, ordinary kids who still have to study. Don't say that, said Lily Stone, Uncle Daniel's daughter, standing beside her with fake sweetness dripping from every word. Our dear cousin just doesn't think we're worth talking to. That's what people call the speech of the chosen. Coming late, right? They laughed back and forth while the house staff lowered their heads. Their shoulders still shook. They were laughing, too, at the dumb girl who couldn't speak. I walked past them with no expression at all. To me, they looked like 2 grasshoppers jumping around in front of my shoes. Pointless and childish. My mother saw all of it. At night, she held me again, and her tears soaked through my shoulder. My Savannah, why won't you talk? Just one word. Just one. If I could hear even one word from you, I could die in peace. I could feel her body trembling. That was the despair of a mother. My heart wasn't made of iron. For the first time, I wavered. Maybe I should speak. I was just about to open my mouth and try to force out that awkward first syllable, when hurried footsteps came pounding outside the study. Mr. Brooks, our old butler, practically stumbled through the doorway. Ma'am, bad news. The people from America are here. The Wall Street shark, Charles King. He's at the company already. My mother's face went white. Charles King. That name had hung over Stone Holdings like a storm cloud for years. He was one of Wall Street's nastiest vultures, the kind who specialized in shorting old family-run empires across the Pacific. In the last few years alone, he'd swallowed 3 companies the size of ours. What does he want? My mother asked. Mr. Brooks's voice shook. He says he's here to discuss an acquisition, but he's being outrageously disrespectful. He said Stone Holdings should exit the stage of history with some dignity. My mother staggered and grabbed the desk. Everyone knew what discuss an acquisition really meant. It meant forced takeover. In a suit and tie. A storm was coming. I looked out the window at the dirty gray sky. So much for quietly rotting in luxury. Fine. There were always a few blind flies in the world who insisted on buzzing in a sleeping lion's face. My father called an emergency meeting in the top floor boardroom and summoned every family member and core executive. I was brought along too and told to stand in the corner. That was the family rule. The eldest granddaughter had to sit in on major matters, even if she didn't understand a damn thing. Usually I just found a quiet spot and mentally checked out. But that day the air was wrong. The whole room was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Every face in there carried the same ugly shade of humiliated anger. My father sat at the head of the table, his face dark enough to pour rain. Standing across from him was a tall, middle-aged man in a custom suit, gold-rimmed glasses, predatory eyes. The kind of face that looked expensive and cruel at the same time. Charles King, a Wall Street crocodile in human skin. Mr. Stone, he said, is this really how you receive a guest? His tone dripped with mockery. I spent 14 damn hours getting here from New York. This is what you put in front of me? He raised one long finger and pointed at the executives around the room. A bunch of spreadsheet nerds. I talk capital, you talk feelings. I talk market law. You talk family legacy. Honestly. He laughed. Pathetic. The sound bounced off the polished walls of the boardroom and scraped across every nerve in the room. Mr. King, our CFO. Mr. Walker shot to his feet, shaking with rage. This is the boardroom of Stone Holdings. You will not behave like this here. Charles glanced at him sideways, full of contempt. Walker, right? I remember you. You're the one who told me yesterday that family businesses have warmth. He leaned forward. Let me tell you how Wall Street defines warmth. Armed without profit is the temperature of a grave. Only weak people use emotion to cover up incompetence. Mr. Walker's face turned the color of liver. He pointed at Charles' mouth opening and closing, and then nearly collapsed backward from sheer rage. Mr. Walker. Several people lunged to catch him. The room erupted in panicked motion. My father slammed a hand on the table. That's enough. Charles settled back a little, but the sneer never left his face. I gave my father a lazy little nod. Mr. Stone, I won't waste more time. Our funds decision committee has already concluded that your stock won't survive next year. If you sell now, maybe you get $3 billion. If we start shorting you in earnest, you'll be lucky to keep one. And, by the way, we want that South Side waterfront parcel. It's perfect for high-end residential development. Oh, and I hear your tech team is solid. We'd like to poach them as a whole unit. He didn't even get to finish before the room exploded. A low-ball acquisition. A land grab. And they wanted to strip our core team too. This wasn't a negotiation. This was butchery. This is outrageous. Throw this bastard out. We should fight him on this. A few hot-headed shareholders on my second uncle's side were already halfway out of their seats. Charles let out a cold laugh. Fight me? Sure. He turned to Uncle Victor. You're the second brother, right? 3 years ago, the real estate project you LED. How much did that lose? 200 million? 3. Uncle Victor's face went red in an instant, like he'd been slapped. Raw veins stood out on his clenched fist. But not a word came out. Charles turned to another executive. And you, head of marketing. Charles King leaned over the polished mahogany table, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. You spent $40 million on a global rebrand last year. Do you know what your market share growth was? Negative 2.4%. I've seen better returns from putting cash in a blender. He straightened up, buttoning his suit jacket with a gesture of chilling finality. He looked at my father. You don't have a legacy, Mr. Stone. You have a sinking ship full of incompetent rats. And I am offering you the only lifeboat. $3 billion. Sign the term sheet, or I start dumping the 10% float my firm quietly acquired over the last 6 months. By Friday, your stock will be penny trash. By Christmas, you'll be liquidating your wife's jewelry. The room was a graveyard. My father, the great Richard Stone, looked as though he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. His jaw trembled. Uncle Victor was staring at his shoes. The CFO, Mr. Walker, was popping a nitroglycerin pill under his tongue. They were beaten. Charles had used the classic Wall Street shock and awe tactic. Isolate the target, humiliate the defense, and create a false sense of immediate, catastrophic urgency. It was a beautiful play. Honestly, I'd used it myself in my past life during the hostile takeover of a telecom giant in 2014. But watching it happen to my mother's family, watching my father's spine bend under the weight of this arrogant prick's bluff, it ruined my mood. I just wanted to be a rich mute, but Charles King was threatening my trust fund. I sighed. The sound was incredibly soft, but in that dead silent room, it carried. I pushed away from the corner wall. My Mary Jane shoes tapped lightly against the hardwood floor.
Tap. Top. Top.
Everyone's eyes fell on me. My father frowned, his despair momentarily replaced by confusion. Savannah? What are you doing? Brooks, get her out of here. I ignored him. I walked straight up to the massive boardroom table. It was too tall for me to see over properly, so I grabbed the heavy leather chair belonging to the hyperventilating CFO and dragged it backward. The screech of the chair, legs against the floor, made Charles King wince. I climbed onto the chair, standing on the seat, so I was finally eye level with the adults. I looked directly at the Wall Street vulture. I took a breath. My vocal cords felt stiff, rusty from 8 years of deliberate, stubborn silence. I forced the air up, shaping the words with a precision that belonged to a 30-year-old apex predator, not an 8-year-old child. My name is Savannah Stone. My voice was high-pitched, childish, and carrying a slight rasp.
But the
cadence? The cadence was pure, unadulterated ice. The reaction was instantaneous. My mother, standing by the door, dropped her clutch. It hit the floor with a dull thud. My father stopped breathing entirely, his eyes bulging so far out of his skull I thought they might roll onto the mahogany table. Uncle Victor let out a strangled gasp. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes locked on Charles King. I am the only direct heir of the founding branch of Stone Holdings. I continued, the words rolling off my tongue smoother now. And you, Mr. King, are a terrible liar. Charles blinked, utterly thrown off balance. A nervous chuckle escaped him as he looked at my father. Is this a joke, Richard? You trained the mute kid to do a parlor trick to buy time. He didn't train me, I said, cutting him off before my father could even form a syllable. And nobody is buying time. We don't need to. You do. I pointed a small, pale finger at the sleek leather folder in front of him. You came in here swinging a $3 billion hammer, threatening to short us to hell. But let's talk about your firm, Apex Capital.
Let's talk about the
bloodbath you took in the European energy markets last quarter. You're severely overleveraged, Charles. You didn't come to Stone Holdings to conquer us. You came because we have $2 billion in liquid cash reserves and zero long-term
debt.
You don't want our real estate. You want our cash flow to cover the margin calls your creditors are going to demand by the end of the month. The boardroom was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Charles King's predatory smile vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. Who told you that? He stammered, the smooth baritone of his voice cracking. That's proprietary. It's elementary. I scoffed, crossing my arms over my frilly pink dress.
You
filed a 13F 2 weeks ago. You aggressively liquidated your blue chip tech
stocks. Why?
To free up capital. But it wasn't enough. You're drowning, Charles. Your proposed acquisition is a leveraged buyout where you plan to use our assets as the collateral for the mezzanine debt you're taking on to buy us. You're a parasite trying to use the host's own blood for a transfusion. I leaned forward, planting my small hands on the edge of the table. I dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Here is what is going to happen, Mr. King. You're going to take your term sheet, and you're going to walk out of my building. If you dump your 10% float, I will personally ensure Stone Holdings issues a massive stock buyback to absorb the shares at a discount. But while you're busy losing money on that trade, I will leak the full, unredacted analysis of Apex Capital's liquidity crisis to the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and every creditor you owe money to. Your firm will face a bank run by tomorrow morning. You won't just be fired. You'll be investigated by the SEC for securities fraud. Charles was sweating now. Actual beads of perspiration were forming on his forehead, catching the fluorescent light. He looked at the 8-year-old girl, standing on a chair in a pink dress, and he saw a monster. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at the executives. He just slowly reached out, picked up his leather folder, and snapped it shut. You're bluffing, he whispered, though his voice had no conviction. Try me, I replied, unblinking. Go ahead, Charlie. Short my company. I'd love to see you jumping out of a very high window by Friday. He stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him. For a long time, nobody moved. The room was paralyzed in a state of collective
shock.
I turned around, stepping carefully off the chair and back onto the floor.
I
Dusted off my dress. My throat felt a little scratchy. Dad, I said, looking at my father. Richard Stone flinched as if he'd been struck by lightning. Tears were freely streaming down his face, ruining his fierce, ruthless image. He fell to his knees right there in the middle of the boardroom, not caring about his custom suit, not caring about the executives watching him. Savannah, he choked out, reaching for me with trembling hands. You
spoke.
You can speak. I'm thirsty, I said plainly. Get me a juice box. Apple, not grape. And tell Mr. Walker to cancel the marketing department's budget for the next quarter.
If
Charles King noticed their incompetence, the rest of the street will too. My mother broke through the crowd, dropping to her knees next to my father and pulling me into a desperate, crushing hug. She was sobbing uncontrollably, burying her face in my shoulder. My baby. Oh, God, my baby. You're a genius.
My
Perfect, perfect girl. I let her hug me. I patted her back, awkwardly. Well, I thought, looking up at the ceiling. So much for the quiet life. The aftermath of that day was a hurricane. I had underestimated the sheer chaos of breaking an 8-year silence with a masterclass in corporate warfare. My father immediately ordered a total media blackout regarding my sudden recovery. He didn't want the world to know his 8-year-old daughter was a financial prodigy. He wanted to protect me.
but
Within the family, the dynamic shifted like tectonic plates. My cousins, Chloe and Lily, who had relentlessly mocked me, were brought into my father's study the very next day. They stood trembling as my father, looking more terrifying than ever, recounted what I had done. Savannah saved this family, he told them, his voice cold as steel. From now on, when she enters a room, you stand. If she wants quiet, you don't breathe.
do
You understand? They nodded, terrified, tears streaming down their faces. I was sitting in my father's oversized leather armchair, reading the Financial Times and sipping my apple juice. I didn't even look up at them. They were grasshoppers yesterday, and they were grasshoppers today. But Charles King was not a grasshopper. He was a wounded snake, and wounded snakes strike blindly. 3 days later, Apex Capital began heavily shorting Stone holdings. They didn't dump their 10% float all at once. They borrowed millions of shares and flooded the market, creating artificial downward pressure. The media picked
up on it.
Headlines began to flash. Stone Holdings in trouble? Apex Capital bets against Heritage Empire. The stock price dipped by 12% in 2 days. Panic began to spread among the retail investors. My father called an emergency war room meeting. This time, I didn't stand in the corner. I sat at his right hand. A special booster seat had been brought in so I could reach the table comfortably. He's trying to bleed us out, Mr. Walker said, looking frantically at the scrolling red numbers on the monitors. If the stock drops another 5%, our institutional investors might panic and sell. He's doubling down, I said, popping a gummy bear into my mouth. I chewed it thoughtfully. He knows if he fails here, his creditors will eat him.
He's
Risking everything on a naked short. My father looked at me, his eyes full of absolute, unwavering trust. It was almost frightening how quickly he had accepted that his 8-year-old daughter was the smartest person in the room. What do we do, Savannah? We crush him, I said simply. He's relying on the market's fear.
but Wall
Street is governed by 2 emotions, fear and greed. Right now, he's weaponizing
fear.
We need to weaponize greed. I pulled a legal pad toward me and grabbed a crayon. It was the only writing utensil within reach. I quickly sketched out a multi-step plan in waxy blue. Step 1, I said, tapping the paper. We announce a strategic partnership.
Not
Just any partnership. Something future-proof. AI integration. Renewable energy. Expansion. Something that makes retail investors foam at the mouth. But we don't have a partnership like that lined up, Uncle Victor argued, sweating. You have 3 hours to buy a promising AI startup, I replied coldly, glaring at him. Use the discretionary fund. Overpay if you have to.
Just get the press.
Release ready before the closing bell. I turned to my father. Step 2. You call your old friends at Goldman and Morgan Stanley. You tell them Charles King is trapped in a massive short position with no exit liquidity. You whisper the words short squeeze.
They
Hate Charles just as much as we do. If they smell blood in the water, they will start buying up our stock to trap him. And step 3, my father asked, leaning in. I smiled. It was a sweet, innocent smile that made Mr. Walker visibly shudder. Step 3. We execute the stock buyback. We use $1 billion in cash to buy our own shares from the open market. The float shrinks. The price skyrockets. Charles won't be able to buy back the shares he borrowed to cover his short.
his
Brokers will issue a margin call, and his firm will be liquidated. The room was dead silent. The sheer brutality of the plan was staggering.
It
Wasn't just a defense, it was an execution. Do it, my father commanded the room. Do exactly as she says. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline, ringing phones, and screaming traders. At 2 p.m. on Thursday, Stone Holdings announced the acquisition of a cutting-edge quantum computing AI firm. The stock stopped dropping. At 3 p.m., rumors began circulating on Bloomberg terminals that institutional whales were quietly accumulating Stone Holdings stock. The price ticked upward. At exactly 9:30 a.m. on Friday, when the opening bell rang, Stone Holdings announced a massive, unprecedented $1 billion stock buyback program. The market exploded. The stock price didn't just recover, it went vertical. It shot up 20%, then 40%, then 60%. Trading was halted twice for volatility, but every time it resumed, it gapped higher. In his high-rise office in New York, Charles King was watching his screens turn. A blinding, catastrophic green. The shares he had borrowed and sold at $40 were now trading at $85, and he was legally obligated to buy them back. By 2 p.m., his prime brokers issued the margin call. By 4 p.m., the closing bell rang. Stone Holdings closed up 112% for the week. Apex Capital was bankrupt. I watched the financial news network on the TV in my father's office. The anchor was frantically reporting the sudden collapse of Apex Capital, citing a historic miscalculation and an epic short squeeze orchestrated by the leadership of Stone Holdings. My father poured himself a glass of scotch. He poured me a glass of sparkling
cider.
He walked over, knelt down beside my chair, and clinked his glass against mine. To my heir, he whispered, his eyes shining with a mixture of immense pride and a deep, respectful fear. I took a sip of the cider. It was sweet. Just don't expect me to come to the office every day, I said lazily.
I have
3rd grade to finish. 10 years later, the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons in Manhattan. I stood looking out over the glittering skyline, a glass of vintage Bordeaux in my hand. I was 18 years old. I had grown into exactly the woman my mother always wanted me to be: graceful, well-read, with perfect manners and a soft voice. Outwardly, I was the flawless, silver-spoon socialite of the Stone family. But Wall Street knew the truth. They called me the Silent Reaper. Since I was 8, I had operated from the shadows, guiding Stone Holdings. Through my father, he was the face, I was the brain. We had tripled the company's valuation, expanded into tech and renewable resources, and crushed anyone foolish enough to cross our path. Tomorrow, I was officially stepping in as the youngest CEO in the history of the Fortune 500. As my father was retiring, the door to the suite clicked open. My assistant, a sharp, terrified young man named Davis, hurried in. Miss Stone, the final proxy votes from the board have been tallied.
It's
unanimous. You're officially the chairman and CEO. Thank you, Davis, I said without turning around. And what of Uncle Victor's little rebellion? Davis swallowed hard. He and his faction attempted to dump their shares in the dark pools to crash the stock before your swearing in, just as you predicted.
we
Intercepted the trades through the shell companies you set up. We bought out his entire faction at a 30% discount.
he no longer has a seat on the board.
He's ruined. I took a slow sip of my wine. Blood is thicker than water, but capital is thicker than blood. Uncle Victor had spent 10 years resenting my power, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. He forgot that I didn't have moments of weakness. Have his security badge deactivated, I said smoothly. And send my cousin, Chloe, a lovely fruit basket. Let her know her trust fund has been restructured to pay out only if she maintains a full-time job. Yes, ma'am. Davis hesitated. There is one more thing. A man is here to see
You.
Security stopped him in the lobby, but he says he has an appointment. A Mr. Charles King. I smiled. Send him up. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. Charles King stepped into the suite. The last decade had not been kind to the Wall Street crocodile. His hair was completely white. His expensive suits had been replaced by a modest, slightly worn trench coat, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the hollow stare of a beaten dog. After Apex Capital collapsed, he had faced federal investigations, massive fines, and a lifetime ban from trading securities. He had been reduced to teaching community college finance courses in New Jersey. He looked at me, standing by the window. He didn't see an 8-year-old girl in a pink dress anymore. He saw a predator at the peak of her power. Miss Stone, he rasped. Charles, I replied softly. I appreciate you coming. He walked forward slowly, clutching a manila folder to his chest. You sent
For me.
Your lawyers said there was an opportunity for me. A consultant role. I did, I said, walking over to the sleek glass desk in the center of the room. I sat down and crossed my legs. Stone Holdings is acquiring a distressed asset management firm in London. It's a mess, full of toxic debt, arrogant executives, and rotting infrastructure. I need someone to go in there, strip it to the studs, fire everyone, and liquidate the remains. I looked at him. I need a vulture. Charles stared at me, his hands trembling. He had spent 10 years hating me, dreaming of revenge, only to realize he was outmatched by a child. And now that child was offering him a crumb from her table, a chance to do what he loved most, destroy a company. Why me? He asked, his voice cracking. After everything, why offer me anything? I leaned back in my chair, the dim light catching my eyes. Because you taught me something valuable when I was 8 years old, Charles. You taught me that weakness invites aggression. You forced me to speak. You forced me to take the throne. I smiled, and it was the same terrifying, innocent smile I had given my father 10 years ago. Consider this payment for services rendered. I pushed a contract across the desk. You work for me now. You breathe when I say so. You eat what I leave you.
Sign
it, and you can have a taste of the game again. Refuse, and you can go back to New Jersey and grade freshman midterms until you die. Charles King looked at the contract. Then he looked at me. The absolute domination in the room was suffocating. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking violently, and signed his name. Good boy, I murmured. Davis will show you out. As the door closed behind him, I turned back to the window. The rain had stopped, and the city lights were reflecting off the wet pavement below. Millions of people, millions of dollars, moving in a ceaseless, chaotic rhythm. In my past life, I had talked myself to death trying to climb this mountain. I had played the game, stressed over the numbers, and burned out before I ever truly reached the top. In this life, I had tried to stay silent. I had tried to hide. But the truth is, a lion can only pretend to be a house cat for so long before it gets hungry. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window, feeling the vibration of the city below. I didn't need to speak to rule them anymore. My silence had become a weapon sharper than words. I was Savannah Stone. And this time, I wasn't just enjoying the ride. I owned the track.